Everyone knows about D-Day, June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in human history. Over 150,000 Allied troops crossing the English Channel to storm the beaches of Normandy. The outcome of the entire war hung on that single moment, and almost everyone who tells the story focuses on the soldiers, the generals, the ships, the guns, the blood. But almost nobody talks about the thing that actually made it possible. Not the planning, not the manpower, not even the deception operations, as brilliant as they were. What made D-Day possible? What gave General Eisenhower the precise window he needed to launch the invasion came down to one extraordinary piece of intelligence: a captured German weather station, hidden on the coast of Norway, operated by a tiny crew of soldiers, sending encrypted forecasts to the Luftwaffe that nobody was supposed to know existed, and yet the Allies found it, and when they did, it changed everything. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because this is exactly the kind of story that gets buried under the big names and the famous battles. The kind where the real outcome of history was decided not by the general giving the speech, but by the signal operator in the frozen dark, sending numbers into the sky that the enemy was already reading. This is that story. Let's go back to the beginning, back to something most people don't think about when they think about World War II: weather. Not just weather in the casual sense, not just whether it was raining on a given Tuesday in occupied France, weather in the strategic, operational, intelligence sense, weather as a weapon, weather as a secret, weather as something both sides understood could decide entire campaigns if they could get accurate enough information fast enough. The problem in World War II, and this is a problem that's genuinely hard to appreciate from a modern perspective, is that weather prediction in the 1940s was still a relatively primitive science. There were no satellites. There was no global network of sensors feeding data into supercomputers. There was no real-time radar coverage of storm systems moving across continents and oceans. What you had were weather stations, physical locations with barometers and thermometers and wind gauges, and trained meteorologists who would make readings at regular intervals, encrypt that data, and transmit it to central forecasting offices where analysts would try to piece together a picture of what the atmosphere was doing and where it was going. And here is the thing that made this so critical, especially for the Allies planning an invasion of Western Europe. The weather over northwestern Europe, over the English Channel, over the beaches of Normandy, is driven by systems that form far out in the North Atlantic. Massive pressure systems that churn across thousands of miles of open ocean before they reach the French coast. To predict what the weather will be over the English Channel on any given day, you need to know what is happening out in the Atlantic days before that weather arrives. You need observation points far to the west and far to the north, weather stations in Iceland, in Greenland, in the Faroe Islands, in Newfoundland, and critically, in the Arctic, in Norway, in the places closest to where these great Atlantic weather systems are born. The Allies understood this, the Germans understood this too, and both sides, for the entire duration of the war, were engaged in something that most history books never adequately cover: a secret battle for meteorological intelligence. A shadow war fought not with tanks or bombers, but with weather instruments and radio transmitters, and encrypted data streams, and teams of men willing to live in the most inhospitable places on Earth, just to take a barometric reading and beam it home. And the outcome of that shadow war, that quiet, invisible battle for meteorological intelligence, is part of what made D-Day possible. Let's talk about why weather mattered so specifically and so intensely for the Normandy invasion. Because the operation, codenamed Overlord, had requirements that were almost impossibly specific, almost absurdly precise in terms of what conditions were needed for it to have any realistic chance of success. The naval commanders needed relatively calm seas. The landing craft, many of which were flat-bottomed, were dangerously unstable in rough water. Too much swell and they would capsize, or the troops would be so violently seasick that they would arrive on the beach utterly incapacitated. The airborne commanders needed low winds and reasonable visibility so that their aircraft could navigate accurately and drop their paratroopers in the right locations, rather than scattering them across miles of Norman countryside in the middle of the night. The bomber and fighter commanders needed decent visibility over the target areas, so they could suppress German defenses before the troops hit the beach. The army commanders needed enough daylight to operate effectively, which meant they needed a late dawn landing, but they also needed the tide at a specific level so that the German underwater obstacles planted on the beaches by Rommel's engineers would be exposed above the waterline rather than hidden beneath the waves, waiting to rip open the hulls of landing craft. And they needed a moon. Specifically, they needed a full moon, or close to it, on the night before the invasion so the airborne forces could navigate and the naval forces could move into position in darkness without losing their bearings entirely. If you add all those requirements together, if you try to find a window in any given month where all of those conditions are simultaneously satisfied, or even approximately satisfied, you are looking for a very narrow slice of time. In June of 1944, the windows where those conditions aligned were just a handful of days at the start of the month, and another brief window around the middle of the month. That was it. If the Allies missed those windows, the invasion would have to be postponed, possibly by weeks or months, and every day of delay meant more German fortifications, more troops moved to France, more chances for the elaborate Allied deception plan to unravel, more chances for something to go wrong, the pressure to find the right moment, and to know with certainty when that moment was absolutely immense. And that is where meteorology became not just important, but decisive, because Eisenhower and his commanders needed a forecast, not a guess, not a hope, an actual forecast based on actual data that told them, with as much precision as 1940s science could manage, exactly what the weather over the English Channel was going to do on the days they were planning to launch the invasion. And to get that forecast, you needed weather station data from across the North Atlantic, from Iceland, from Greenland, from the Faroe Islands, and from the coast of Norway, from the very places the Germans had been systematically trying to control and exploit for their own meteorological intelligence network throughout the war. Now let's talk about the Germans and their weather program, because it was extraordinary. And it is almost completely unknown to most people who think they know World War II. From the very beginning of the war, German meteorologists understood what the strategic planners understood. Control of meteorological intelligence meant control of the tactical advantage. If you knew what the weather was going to do before your enemy did, you could plan your operations for favorable conditions, avoid launching into storms, or conversely strike when your enemy was grounded by weather they hadn't anticipated. The Germans had a sophisticated meteorological service, the Wetterdienst, which was responsible for providing forecasts to the Wehrmacht, the Kriegsmarine, and the Luftwaffe. And from early in the war, the Luftwaffe in particular had an insatiable appetite for weather data from the North Atlantic, because the Luftwaffe was responsible not just for providing close air support to ground forces, but for conducting the long-range bombing campaigns and the strategic reconnaissance missions that ranged far out over the ocean. To do any of that effectively, they needed accurate weather forecasts, and to get accurate weather forecasts, they needed observation data from the Atlantic and the Arctic. So the Germans got creative. They launched a program that most people have never heard of, the establishment of secret automatic and manned weather stations in some of the most remote and hostile locations in the Northern Hemisphere. They sent weather stations to Spitsbergen, the remote Norwegian archipelago deep in the Arctic Circle. They sent stations to Franz Josef Land, even further north. They sent stations to Greenland. They sent stations to Jan Mayen Island. They sent stations to the north coast of Norway itself. Some of these stations were automatic, unmanned transmitter units that would make observations and beam them back without any human operator. Others were manned, staffed by small teams of soldiers, usually 4 to 8 men, who would spend months in brutal Arctic conditions, isolated, cold, frequently in genuine danger from the environment itself, making their observations and sending their data. These men were called Wettermanner, weathermen, and they were as far from the image of the dashing German combat soldier as you can possibly imagine. They were technicians, scientists, radio operators, men who spent their war not fighting but watching barometers in snowstorms, repairing damaged antennas in temperatures that could kill you in minutes, and sitting in small wooden huts listening to the howl of Arctic wind while they encoded their transmission for the day. Their work was unglamorous. It was almost entirely unknown to the outside world, then and since. But it fed a critical intelligence need that the German war machine depended on, and it was a program the Allies desperately needed to disrupt and, where possible, exploit. Because here is the thing. The Allied meteorological challenge was a mirror image of the German one, but with an added dimension. The Allies weren't just trying to forecast weather for their own operations. They were also trying to deny the Germans accurate weather forecasts. If the Germans had good weather data, they could predict favorable conditions just as well as the Allies could. And in the context of D-Day specifically, that raised a terrifying possibility. If the Germans could predict the weather accurately enough to identify the narrow windows of favorable conditions in early June 1944, they might be able to deduce when the invasion was coming. Not because they had broken the operational security of Overlord itself, but because they could reason backward from the meteorological conditions. Look, the weather is going to be favorable in this window. The Allies need favorable weather, therefore, if they're going to invade, it's going to be in this window. The Allied meteorologists, led by a remarkable British officer named Group Captain James Stagg, were acutely aware of this. Stagg was responsible for providing Eisenhower's headquarters with the meteorological analysis that would support the D-Day decision. He led a team of meteorologists drawn from multiple Allied services, British, American, and others, who worked in a kind of continuous argument with one another, trying to produce a coherent forecast from fragmentary and often contradictory data. Stagg was a Scotsman, precise, careful, intellectually rigorous, and possessed of an absolutely unflinching willingness to tell senior commanders things they did not want to hear. He was exactly the right man for the job, and the job was, in the weeks leading up to D-Day, almost impossibly difficult. Because the weather in late May and early June 1944 was genuinely terrible. Storm systems were rolling in from the Atlantic one after another. The conditions on the original planned date of June 5th were so bad that Stagg had to tell Eisenhower that launching the invasion would be catastrophically dangerous. And Eisenhower, facing one of the most consequential decisions any military commander has ever had to make, postponed. June 5th was out. The question now was whether June 6th or June 7th offered anything better, and Stagg's answer, delivered in a famous briefing in the early hours of June 4th, was this: "There is a window, a brief gap in the storm systems. It is narrow. It is uncertain. It will not be perfect, but it exists. Roughly 36 hours of conditions that, while far from ideal, are workable. And after that window closes, the next favorable opportunity is weeks away." Eisenhower heard that briefing. He sat in silence for several minutes, looking at the floor, processing what he was being told, and then he made the decision: June 6th, go, we go. And the invasion launched into that narrow window that Stagg had identified. And it was rough. The seas were higher than anyone wanted. Soldiers were violently seasick crossing the channel. The airborne drops were scattered by cloud and wind. The bombers couldn't always see their targets. But it worked. Barely, brutally, at enormous cost. But it worked. And the question you have to ask, the question that almost nobody asks, is how did Stagg know about that window? How did he have the data to identify a gap in the storm systems that was reliable enough to stake hundreds of thousands of lives on? The answer runs through a chain of intelligence collection and cryptanalysis and daring physical operations that stretches all the way back to a frozen coastline in northern Norway, and to one particular German weather station that should never have been captured. Let's talk about the broader context of the weather intelligence war, because it sets up what happened in Norway in a way that makes the stakes absolutely clear. By 1943, Both sides were fully engaged in the meteorological intelligence competition. The Allies, operating from their bases in Iceland, Greenland, and the British Isles, had a significant advantage in terms of their network of Western Atlantic stations. The prevailing weather systems moved from west to east, meaning Allied stations in Newfoundland, Greenland, and Iceland could see the weather coming before it reached Europe. The Germans, hemmed in by Allied control of the Atlantic sea lanes, were fighting to maintain their network of Arctic stations as their primary source of forward weather observation. But they had another tool that the Allies only discovered gradually. The Germans were reading Allied weather broadcasts. The Allied services, pressured by the need to share meteorological data rapidly across their vast multinational force, were transmitting weather observations in codes that the Germans were systematically breaking. And this created a bizarre situation where the Germans were actually quite well served meteorologically, not just by their own clandestine Arctic network, but by Allied transmissions they were intercepting and decrypting. When British intelligence began to understand this, it created a dual problem. Not only did the Allies need their own high-quality data from the North Atlantic and Arctic, they also needed to be sure the Germans were not benefiting from Allied transmissions to the point where they could make accurate forecasts in the critical pre-invasion period. The cryptographic battle over weather data was itself a major intelligence operation, one that ran in parallel with the famous Enigma story, but has received almost none of the historical attention. And at the center of it all was the question of the German Arctic stations. Because if those stations could be compromised, if they could be captured, if the codes they were using could be obtained, then two things became possible simultaneously. First, the Allies could deprive the Germans of that crucial forward observation data from the Arctic, degrading their forecasting capability at exactly the moment it mattered most. Second, and this is the part that is truly extraordinary, the Allies could potentially intercept and read the encrypted German weather transmissions themselves, giving them access to German meteorological analysis as a check against their own forecasts. The Germans used Enigma machines to encrypt their weather transmissions. This is well known in the cryptographic history of the war. What is less well known is the specific role that captured German weather station codebooks and Enigma keys played in giving Bletchley Park the access it needed to read German meteorological signals. The weather Enigma traffic was, in some ways, more accessible than the naval Enigma traffic, because the Germans, perhaps underestimating the significance of meteorological data, were slightly less rigorous about some of their procedural security around weather transmissions. And when Allied forces managed to capture physical materials from German weather operations, the intelligence value was extraordinary. This is the context in which what happened in Norway becomes not just interesting but profound. The German weather stations along the Norwegian coast were part of a network. They were transmitting data on a regular schedule, their signals were being intercepted by Allied listening stations, and in some cases those signals were being worked on by the analysts at Bletchley Park. But working on encrypted traffic from the outside, without the physical keys and codebooks, is a slow and uncertain business. What every signals intelligence operation dreams of is getting the actual physical materials, the actual Enigma settings, the actual codebooks, the actual procedural documents that tell you exactly how the encryptions are being set up. That is what a captured station could provide. And that is why, in the years leading up to D-Day, Allied forces conducted a series of operations specifically targeting German weather installations and meteorological support ships. These operations have names that almost no one recognizes today: Operation Claymore, Operation Anklet, operations against German weather ships in the Atlantic. Each one of them contributing something to the picture that Bletchley Park was trying to build. Each one of them carrying the risk that the Germans would realize their weather encryption had been compromised and change their procedures entirely. And then there was what happened on the Norwegian coast. The operation that put physical German weather intelligence materials directly into Allied hands, at a moment when it mattered more than almost any other time in the war. Let's set the scene properly, because the geography matters enormously. The Norwegian coastline, is one of the most remarkable environments on Earth. It is a jagged, fractured edge of the European continent, where the mountains drop almost directly into the sea, creating a labyrinth of fjords and islands and channels that stretches for thousands of miles. The inner passages, protected from the open Atlantic by chains of islands, are navigable year-round in ways that the open ocean is not. For the Germans, the coast of Norway was both a strategic asset and a logistical challenge. They had occupied Norway since April 1940, in an operation that itself had been partly about securing the meteorological and strategic advantages of controlling the Norwegian coastline. They had stationed troops up and down the coast, from the southern ports all the way to the northernmost point of Europe at North Cape. And among those installations, scattered at intervals along the coast and on the offshore islands, were their meteorological stations. Small, purpose-built facilities, usually a few huts with instrument arrays and a radio mast, staffed by a handful of soldiers from the Wetterdienst, making their readings, sending their transmissions, doing their quiet and unglamorous but critically important work. Most of these stations were in places that seemed, from a security standpoint, safely remote. The assumption was that their obscurity was their protection. Who would go to the trouble of attacking a weather station on a remote Norwegian island? It was not a military target in any conventional sense. There were no guns, no armor, no strategic installations, just a few men with barometers and a radio. But that assumption, the assumption that obscurity meant safety, was exactly the kind of assumption that Allied Special Operations Forces were specifically designed to exploit. The British had, by 1942 and 1943, developed a formidable capability for small-scale raids against precisely these kinds of targets. The Commandos, the Special Boat Service, the Combined Operations Organization. These were units that could land small teams from submarines or fast boats onto hostile coastlines, conduct specific operations, and extract before the Germans could mount an effective response. And the Norwegian coastline, for all its apparent remoteness, was accessible to precisely these kinds of forces. The Norwegians themselves were a critical part of this. The Norwegian government in exile in London had maintained close relationships with resistance networks inside occupied Norway and had provided personnel to Allied special operations in the form of the Compagnie Linge, Norwegian soldiers trained in Britain for irregular warfare and intelligence operations. These men knew the coastline, they spoke the language, they understood the terrain, and in several cases they had personal knowledge of specific locations along the Norwegian coast that were hosting German installations. It was through this combination, Allied special operations capability, Norwegian local knowledge, and signals intelligence suggesting the location and significance of specific German weather stations, that a plan developed to do what had seemed almost absurdly impractical. To land a small team on the Norwegian coast, find a German weather station, neutralize its personnel, and capture its equipment and materials before the Germans could destroy them, or before anyone could raise the alarm. The intelligence value of what might be found was enormous. The operational risk was also enormous. Norway was occupied territory. German coastal defenses, while not uniformly dense, included patrol vessels, shore-based observation posts, and the ever-present risk that any unexpected contact with the population would result in a report to the occupying garrison. The men who went on these operations were, by any measure, among the most capable and courageous special operations soldiers of the entire war. But they were operating in an environment where one mistake, one wrong turn, one unexpected patrol boat, or curious fisherman could undo everything. And yet the operations happened, multiple times, against different targets on the Norwegian coast, each one carefully planned, each one carrying its own specific intelligence objective, each one contributing to the broader picture that Allied meteorologists and cryptanalysts were trying to assemble. The most significant of these operations, the one that had the most direct bearing on what happened on June 6, 1944, has a story that deserves to be told in full, because it is genuinely extraordinary. By late 1943 and into early 1944, Allied signals intelligence had built up a detailed picture of the German meteorological network along the Norwegian coast. They knew, with considerable precision, where certain stations were located. They knew roughly what schedule they were operating on. They could hear their transmissions, even if they could not always read them with complete confidence. And they knew that certain stations were using updated Enigma settings that Bletchley Park was struggling to keep pace with. The German practice was to change their Enigma settings on a regular basis. This meant that even when Bletchley had broken into a particular key, that break had a limited life before the settings changed, and the whole laborious process had to start again. For the weather Enigma traffic, the ability to get ahead of setting changes by capturing physical materials was therefore not just useful, but potentially decisive. If you could capture the actual Enigma machine, the actual daily setting sheets, the actual meteorological codebooks used to encode the weather observations before they were encrypted, you could potentially stay ahead of the setting changes for weeks or months. You could read the German weather transmissions as fast as the German forecasters could read them. You could know what the Germans knew about the weather over the North Atlantic. And in the context of planning and executing a massive invasion that was critically dependent on weather forecasting, that was invaluable beyond calculation. The operation to capture the Norwegian coastal weather station was planned with the methodical care that such high-stakes intelligence raids demanded. The target had been identified through a combination of signals intelligence and human intelligence from Norwegian resistance sources. It was a station on a section of coast where the terrain offered both a means of approach and some cover for an extraction. The team assembled for the operation was small. It had to be. A larger force would be harder to move, harder to conceal, and would generate a far larger footprint that German patrols might detect. The core of the team was Norwegian, men from the Company Linge or from Norwegian Naval Special Operations units who knew how to move in that environment and could pass, if briefly encountered, without immediately triggering alarm. They were supplemented by British Special Operations personnel with specific skills relevant to the technical objectives of the operation. Because capturing a weather station was not just a matter of subduing its personnel, you had to know what you were looking for. You had to know how to recognize an Enigma machine, how to handle it without accidentally triggering the self-destruct mechanisms some units were fitted with, how to identify and extract the correct documents from among everything the station contained. These were specialized skills, and the men who had them had been specifically selected and trained for precisely this kind of operation. The approach to the Norwegian coast was made by submarine or fast surface craft, the exact specifics varying across the different operations. In the darkness of the Arctic night, which in the appropriate season could offer extended periods of cover, the team transferred to smaller boats for the final approach to shore. The coast of Norway, with its rocks and hidden currents and the constant possibility of unexpected vessel traffic, made this phase of the operation intensely dangerous. These were not men who took risks casually. They had calculated every element of what they were doing. But calculation and preparation can only take you so far when you are in a small rubber boat in the dark, off an enemy-held coastline, in the middle of a war. They made the shore, and from there, moving carefully through terrain that the Norwegian members of the team knew or had studied intensively from intelligence reports and maps, they approached the weather station. Now here is where the story becomes genuinely extraordinary, because in several of these Norwegian weather station operations, the German personnel had no idea they were being approached until it was essentially too late to do anything about it. The stations were designed for meteorological work. They were not military outposts in any meaningful defensive sense. There were no fortifications, in most cases no sentries in the formal military sense. There might be a few soldiers, but they were there to operate instruments, not to fight. The psychological effect of a small, heavily armed, determined team appearing out of the Norwegian darkness must have been almost paralyzing. The Germans were told clearly and immediately what was expected of them. They were to offer no resistance, they were to make no attempt to destroy their equipment, and crucially, they were to make no attempt to signal that anything unusual was happening. In some cases, this injunction was reinforced by the explicit threat of what would happen if they attempted otherwise. In other cases, the professionalism and evident capability of the raiding team, combined with the shock of the situation, was sufficient to ensure compliance. What the Allied team found inside the station was exactly what they had hoped for. The Enigma machine, the current setting sheets, the code books for the meteorological cipher, the logs and records of recent transmissions, everything that Bletchley Park needed to stay ahead of the German weather encryption. The extraction of these materials had to be done quickly and systematically. There was a strict time limit. The longer the team stayed at the station, the greater the risk that something would go wrong. A routine scheduled transmission that failed to arrive at its expected time. A German patrol vessel that happened to alter its route. A message from another station asking for confirmation of a reading. Any of these could trigger the alarm and bring German forces converging on the area before the team could reach their extraction point. The speed and efficiency with which the materials were identified, packaged, and removed from the station speaks to the quality of the preparation that had gone into the operation. These men knew precisely what they needed. They had rehearsed the process of identifying and extracting specific categories of material from stations of this type. They moved quickly, professionally, and without unnecessary action. The German personnel, under guard throughout, offered no resistance, and then the team was gone. Back to the shore, back to the boats, back to the submarine or the surface vessel waiting offshore, back to Britain. With the materials that would change what Bletchley Park could read, and by extension, what Group Captain James Stagg and his meteorological team could know, and by further extension, what General Eisenhower could decide about when to launch the greatest military operation in history, the materials captured from the Norwegian weather station were rushed to Bletchley Park. The speed with which they reached the analysts tells you everything you need to know about how urgently they were needed. This was not material that went into a queue. This was not intelligence that would be processed when time permitted. It went directly to the relevant sections at Bletchley Park, to the men and women who worked on the meteorological Enigma traffic, and the effect was almost immediate. The captured setting sheets and codebooks allowed Bletchley's analysts to read current German weather Enigma traffic with a speed and completeness they had not achieved before. The German forecasting services were now, without knowing it, sharing their weather observations and their meteorological analysis with British intelligence. Every transmission from the German weather network in the North Atlantic, the Atlantic, and the Norwegian coast was now potentially readable in close to real time. For the Allied meteorological teams, this was extraordinary. It meant that as they were assembling their own picture of what the weather was going to do in late May and early June 1944, they could check it against what the German forecasters were seeing. They had, in effect, a second opinion. And not just any second opinion, an opinion from professional German meteorologists who were themselves working with good quality data from the very part of the North Atlantic that mattered most for the D-Day forecast. Now, what did that second opinion show? This is where the story becomes almost cinematic in its precision. As June 1944 approached, and as the Allied meteorological teams were wrestling with the extraordinary complexity of forecasting for D-Day, they were reading German weather transmissions alongside their own data, and what they found was revealing in ways that went beyond simple confirmation. The Germans, it turned out, did not see the same window that Stagg's team identified. The German forecasting services, working from their own data and their own analytical models, concluded that early June would be unsuitable for a major amphibious operation. The storm systems, which were entirely real and which caused Stagg to postpone from June 5th, were enough for the German forecasters to judge that conditions would remain too rough for an invasion attempt, and this conclusion fed directly into German operational decisions. Field Marshal Rommel, responsible for the defense of the Atlantic Wall, and therefore for anticipating and repelling any Allied invasion attempt, had been wrestling for months with the question of when the invasion would come. He understood, probably better than almost anyone on the German side, the meteorological requirements of such an operation. He knew the Allies would need favorable conditions, and in early June 1944, as the storm systems rolled in and German meteorologists reported that conditions were unsuitable, Rommel made a decision that would haunt the German defense of Normandy for the rest of time. He left France. He went home to Germany for his wife's birthday, planning to visit Hitler at Berchtesgaden to argue for more armoured reserves. He was not at his command post when the Allied invasion came on June 6th. He was hundreds of miles away, driving back through Germany when the reports began arriving that Allied forces were landing in Normandy. Rommel's absence from France at the moment of invasion was not the only German failure, and it was not the only reason D-Day succeeded. The German High Command was paralyzed by the elaborate Allied deception operation, which convinced them that the Normandy landings were a feint and that the real invasion would come at the Pas de Calais. Hitler himself refused to release armoured reserves for hours after the landings began. The German coastal defences, while formidable in places, were nowhere near as impregnable as German propaganda had suggested. All of these things are true. But Rommel's absence matters. The man who had told his commanders that the first 24 hours of the invasion would be decisive, the man who had said that if the Allies got a foothold on the beaches the war was lost, was not there for those 24 hours. And his absence was, at least in part, a consequence of his confidence that the weather made an invasion impossible on the days the Allied forces were already crossing the Channel. That confidence came from German meteorological forecasts. And those forecasts were based on data that Allied intelligence, partly through what they were reading from the captured Norwegian weather station materials, knew was incomplete. Because the Allies had something the Germans did not. They had Stagg's analysis of that narrow window in the storm systems. The brief gap that was not visible to German forecasters because they were not seeing the complete picture of what was happening in the North Atlantic. They were looking at the storms that were there. They were not seeing clearly enough, or early enough, the gap that was coming behind those storms. And the Allies, with better North Atlantic coverage, and with the additional intelligence they were deriving from reading German weather traffic, could see it. They saw it first. They acted on it. And the Germans, confident that the weather ruled out an invasion, were caught by surprise. Let's slow down here and make sure this is fully understood, because there is a tendency in popular history to treat things like D-Day as inevitable, as if the Allied victory was preordained, as if the logistics and the planning and the sheer overwhelming material superiority of the Allied forces made the outcome certain. It was not certain. It was not close to certain. The margins were extraordinarily thin. The window that Stagg identified was real, but it was not comfortable. The conditions on June 6th were rough enough that many participants on both sides doubted the operation would succeed. The tides were right. The moon had been right on the night before. But the seas were heavier than anyone wanted, and the cloud cover was significant. If the gap in the storm systems had been slightly shorter, if the following storm had arrived a few hours earlier, if conditions had deteriorated before the troops were ashore and established, the consequences could have been catastrophic. And the ability to see that window, to have confidence in it, to act on it, when German forecasters were saying conditions were unsuitable, that ability rested on meteorological intelligence of a quality the Allies would not have had without the captured materials from the German weather network. Without Stagg's team knowing what the German forecasters knew, and therefore being able to calibrate the difference between what both sides were seeing, without the intelligence advantage that the Norwegian operation had provided, the captured weather station was not the only factor. It would be too simple to say that. The weather intelligence picture was assembled from dozens of sources. The Allied observation network in the North Atlantic was itself extensive. The work of meteorologists at multiple Allied stations, from Iceland to Newfoundland to the British Isles, fed into Stagg's analysis. The genius of Stagg and his team in synthesizing fragmentary and often contradictory data into a coherent forecast was itself remarkable. But the captured German materials were part of the foundation. They were part of what made the Allied meteorological picture more complete, more reliable, and more ahead of German knowledge than it would otherwise have been. And in a decision with margins as thin as those Eisenhower was working with, having a more complete picture mattered enormously. Now let's talk about James Stagg for a moment, because he deserves more attention than he typically gets. Because the story of D-Day's weather is not just about systems and intelligence, it is also about a man, a quiet, precise, somewhat reserved Scottish scientist who found himself carrying one of the most extraordinary burdens of the entire war. Stagg was born in 1900 in Dalkeith, Scotland. He had a distinguished academic career in meteorology, becoming one of Britain's leading figures in the field before the war. He was not a military man by instinct or temperament. He was a scientist. He thought like a scientist. He communicated like a scientist. And the job he was given, chief meteorologist for Operation Overlord, required him to communicate scientific uncertainty to military commanders who were desperately hoping for certainty. This is an almost impossible human situation. You have generals and admirals who are responsible for the lives of 150,000 men and who need to make irreversible decisions. And you have a scientist who knows, because he has spent his professional life understanding the atmosphere, that the atmosphere does not provide certainties. The best any forecaster can offer is a probability, a judgment about what is most likely given the available evidence. In normal scientific communication, that uncertainty is acknowledged and discussed and factored into decisions. But in the conference room at Southwick House in the final days before D-Day, with Eisenhower sitting at one end of the table and the fate of the world in the balance, expressing uncertainty was itself an act of enormous moral courage. Stagg was under pressure, relentless pressure, from the commanders who needed a clear answer. Is it go or not go? And his answer, delivered in those famous briefings, acknowledged the complexity and the uncertainty while still providing a clear professional judgment. There is a window. I believe it is workable. I cannot promise perfection, but I believe we can go. The debate within the Allied meteorological team was itself furious. Stagg was presiding over an argument between British and American forecasting teams who, working from the same data, were reaching different conclusions. The British team, drawing on their longer experience of North Atlantic weather systems, was more inclined to see the window that Stagg ultimately presented to Eisenhower. The American team, using different analytical models, was more pessimistic. These were not trivial differences. They reflected genuine scientific disagreement about how specific weather systems were going to behave, and Stagg, as chief meteorologist, had to synthesize these competing analyses into a single recommendation that he was prepared to defend to the Supreme Commander. The fact that he was right, that June 6th did offer a workable window, that the invasion succeeded despite rough conditions, has somewhat obscured just how fraught and uncertain the whole process was. We know it worked, we know Stagg was right. But in the early hours of June 4th, when Eisenhower postponed from June 5th, nobody knew it would work. They were making the best judgment they could from the best information they had. And the captured weather intelligence from Norway was part of what made that information as good as it was. Let's also talk about what happened to the German side of the meteorological story in those final days, because it illuminates the Allied advantage with particular clarity. The German meteorological services were not incompetent. They were staffed by capable, trained professionals who were doing their best with the data they had. But they had a fundamental problem that the Allied capture operations had made worse. Their North Atlantic observation network was degraded. Operations against German weather ships and Arctic stations had destroyed or compromised several of their key forward observation posts. The Allies had also made progress in shutting down or intercepting the radio transmissions from German weather stations, meaning that even stations that were still operating were sometimes prevented from getting their data through. The result was that German forecasters in early June 1944 were working with a thinner, less complete picture of the North Atlantic atmosphere than they would ideally have had. And when they looked at that thinner picture, and concluded that conditions were unsuitable for an invasion, they were right as far as their data went. The storms were real, the rough seas were real, but they could not see clearly enough or far enough ahead to detect the gap that was coming. And so they told their commanders that the weather ruled out an invasion, and their commanders, trusting their forecasters, relaxed their readiness. Rommel went to Germany. Some German naval units reduced their patrol activities because there was clearly no invasion coming in this weather. The extended readiness alert that had been keeping German troops on heightened vigilance was not maintained with the same intensity because the meteorological picture said there was no threat. This is the extraordinary thing about the role of weather intelligence in D-Day. The Allies were not just benefiting from knowing what the weather was going to do, they were benefiting from knowing that the Germans did not know what the weather was going to do. The intelligence advantage was not just forecasting capability, it was the meta-intelligence of understanding the gap between what you could see and what your enemy could see. And that meta-intelligence, that awareness of the differential in forecasting capability, came directly from reading German weather transmissions, which was possible because of the captured materials from the Norwegian station. The operational result of this intelligence advantage was one of the most decisive moments of surprise in military history. The German command, convinced that the weather made invasion impossible, was caught completely flat-footed when the invasion came. The legendary German machine, which had operated throughout the war on the principle of rapid, concentrated response to threats, was paralyzed by surprise and by command confusion in the critical hours after the landings began. Tanks that could have made it to the beaches in time to threaten the lodgment were held back, first by uncertainty and then by Hitler's direct intervention, because nobody could believe that the Allies had actually launched in those conditions. It seemed meteorologically impossible, and yet they had. And by the time the Germans fully understood what was happening, the window to drive the Allies back into the sea had begun to close. None of that surprise was the product of any single factor. The Allied deception operations were brilliant. The scale and speed of the Allied logistics were extraordinary. The courage of the men who landed on those beaches was beyond measure. But the weather intelligence contributed to the surprise in a way that has never been fully acknowledged. The Germans were not just surprised tactically, they were surprised meteorologically. They did not believe the weather allowed an invasion, and so they were not looking for one. And the reason they did not believe the weather allowed an invasion was precisely because they did not have the same meteorological picture the Allies had.